Good afternoon and welcome to Earth Save Canada's virtual speaker series. Today we are very pleased to introduce to you Anthony Garoufalis-Auger, and he's going to be speaking about the critical need to transform Canada's food system and how we can make that happen. Now, before I introduce Anthony, I'm just going to make a couple of comments about what's going to happen today. So Anthony will be speaking and presenting for about 45 minutes, and we'll try to leave about 15 minutes at the end to address any questions. Please post your questions or comments in the comment section below this video, and we will get to as many of them as we can. And we encourage you to post any questions or comments you may have. Anyone who makes a comment or question will be entered into a draw to win a $25 gift card from Vegan Supply. So without further ado, I will introduce Anthony. Anthony is a Montreal-based climate emergency organizer, climate policy expert, and public affairs strategist. His work focuses on shifting the climate discourse in Canada from incrementalism to emergency mode action. He is a co-founder of Extinction Rebellion in Quebec and works with the Climate Emergency Unit, where he acts as a sectoral organizer focused on arts and culture and food system transformation. So Anthony, thank you very much for being with us, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks so much for having me. And I'm looking forward to the discussion after this. So I'm just going to share my screen. And I'm going to just start with a little bit of a breakdown of how the presentation is going to go today before I introduce myself. But I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement and then talk about climate breakdown and the impact and also the influence of animal agriculture on it. And then how to go about reducing animal farming emissions. So this presentation is going to focus somewhat on the food system as a whole, but with particular focus on an area that's underrepresented in climate policy, which is animal farming. And then kind of a bit on how we might get organized and how the other side is organized. And hopefully we can have a discussion afterwards about how we can be more active on what I would say is one of the most underrepresented in issues on climate in Canada, maybe not in the world. But in Canada, definitely, we're not really talking about it that much. And I'm coming to you from Tiohtià:ke, otherwise known as Montreal, which is on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. And we're also on Turtle Island, this landmass we call North America. And I wanted to start with a little bit longer of a land acknowledgement than usual, because when we talk about the food system, we're talking about how we use land. And this graph from Our World in Data, I think, really shows it's very illustrative of how land is currently used and the problems with land use. And we know that about 29% of the surface of the earth is land. The rest is ocean. 71% is habitable land. The rest is barren, or glaciers. And then out of that 71%, we have about 50% that's agriculture. And that used to not be the case, but we've expanded agricultural land quite a bit. But on that agricultural land, about 77% of it is used for livestock and growing their feed and the production of their feed. And then when you go break it down, is that actually the global supply of calories, livestock only represent about 18% of the calories consumed by humans, and about 31% of the meat and of the global protein supply. So you can see that the way that we use land is very inefficient. But the issue about using land, I think, bigger than this is actually who does the land belong to, and the discussion that we're having in Canada, this reckoning that we're having for our history of colonialism and genocide. And the Prairie Grasslands, which is what very much considered the breadbasket of Canada, which is where most of the livestock production takes place or the animal farming in Canada takes place, is actually an ecozone that has many indigenous, and also an indigenous culture area with many First Nations living on it. And we talk a lot about the Amazon being deforested for making place for soybean to feed the cattle, but also for cattle production. But we have to kind of reckon with the fact that we've historically destroyed a gigantic landmass in our own history, in our really recent history. We've done so through genocide and politics of starvation. And it's estimated that 75% of the prairie grasslands have been eradicated, replaced primarily by monocultural crops. And the remaining is mostly used for grazing cattle and fenced off. And about 1% of the native prairies in Saskatchewan and Alberta enjoys any official protection. So they're very much these endangered ecosystems, one of the most endangered ecosystems in the world, in our own backyard, that's just been decimated to make place for an imported way of agriculture from Europe. And this has come at the dispossession of land from Indigenous peoples and policies of genocide enacted by successive governments, starting with policies like the Dominions Land Act and national policy of bringing over settlers over to Western provinces with the railroads, and the politics of starvation to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their land to make illegal Indigenous agricultural policies. And this continues up to this day. The impacts of this is where we see it now is that Indigenous peoples face the highest level of malnutrition and food insecurity in the country. And a book recommendation, if you want to learn more about this, is James Bashuk's Clearing the Plains, which is an excellent book that goes over this history, but I think is important when we talk about food systems and then also about the future of land use in the prairie provinces and across this country to really understand the history of who this land belonged to and the history of colonial settler expansion and the impacts it's had on people. And I'd also, before I touch on what can be done to reduce animal farming emissions, kind of go over a bit of the climate science so that we know a little bit about what we're talking about and about the urgency for a rapid food system transformation. And as we know, or maybe some of you don't know, but over the past hundreds of thousands of years, there's been ice ages and there's been a lot of turmoil and ups and downs in the Earth's climate, very rapid changes. But over the last 12,000 years, what we call the Holocene Period, it's actually been some sort of equilibrium. It's not too hot and not too cold, and it's been very good for agricultural production. And we've actually, human civilization, at least Western civilization, was built on these stable agricultural conditions. And this is actually just a very rare period in Earth's history. But unfortunately, what humans are doing is they're since the beginning of the industrial era, have been extraction fossil hydrocarbons from the soil and putting carbon that has been sequestered for hundreds of thousands of years, not millions of years, and back into the atmosphere. And this has increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And here you have a graph, kind of a famous type of graph that you see usually in the climate presentations. But since the pre-industrial era all the way up to now, we've increased, the parts per million in the atmosphere from about 300 to now about 400. And the last time I think I checked was about 416 parts per million. The safe point of stability being about 350. And we've done so in a very short period of time. And we're now at about 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which, Canada is quite a bit more because of our position on top. And this is on the higher parts of the hemisphere. And this is having pretty significant impacts already on agricultural production, but also all around the world. And what we're trying to avoid, and what scientists say we should try to avoid it, what they're saying is dangerous, but what I guess low-lying nations and countries in the global south are saying is genocidal, we're trying to avoid 1.5 degrees of warming, which is a level, that would condemn a lot of low-lying nations to catastrophic levels of sea level rise, but also job conditions. And then 2 degrees is considered extremely dangerous by the scientific community, but that's kind of 1.5 and 2 degrees are the objectives we gave ourselves with the International Climate Conference in Paris about in 2016, I believe. And that's kind of, these are the danger zones that we're trying to avoid. But current government policies, unfortunately, are leading us to about at least 2.9 degrees of warming. So we're not heeding the call of scientists at the moment. Emissions are continuing to go up. And with the past amount of warming that we've committed, the IPCC is saying that, the latest IPCC report, as reported in The Guardian, but the verdict is that humanity is guilty of the climate impacts that we're currently witnessing around the world that have been absolutely catastrophic, and that there's a direct link between our past human activity and the climate crisis that we're currently witnessing. And in Canada, we've witnessed, 2021 was a big year for climate change. I'm just going to go over some of how it impacted even just food production, not to speak of other problems. But we had one of the worst droughts in Canadian history. It was reported quite a bit in the media, but I don't think people realize that, it was one of the worst droughts, if not the worst drought in Canadian history. It impacted severely agricultural production, leading to a massive drop in crops, but also in the crops used to feed livestock. And livestock numbers, animal farming numbers are expected to fall I'm not sure if they're out yet, but there was quite a lot of animals that were killed for lack of food. And because of this, we've seen grocery bills starting to go up. So it started to impact Canadians' wallets. And it's also starting to affect water supply. And there's discussion about what we're going to do about irrigation systems to ensure that we can have an ample supply of food coming in the coming decades. And we should be also thinking about centuries. And another big area is just down south to us, California, over the next 80 years in the literature review, which is a breadbasket, I would say, of North America, is experiencing significant changes. We experienced droughts over the last several years. Worsening droughts and that's dwindling water supplies. And the literature review shows that crop yields are going to decrease significantly in California. And just to put in just the importance of California is over a third of U.S. vegetables and 2/3 of fruits and nuts are grown in California. But a big portion of fruits and vegetables in Canada are also grown in California. 84% of our broccoli and cauliflower, a large percentage of our strawberries, lettuce, carrots, etc. Where it's suppliers, purchasers in Canada are starting to diversify the supply chains, but climate change is everywhere and it's going to infect agriculture. And we got to be prepared in the coming decades and even centuries. We've got to be thinking really long-term about securing our food supply. And we know that the impacts are quite severe and are happening quite abruptly. We know that Madagascar recently is one of the first countries to face climate-induced famine, not led by a conflict. And we're starting to see this happening in front of our own eyes, and we're quickly accelerating towards climate tipping points, which might lead to more rapid changes happening and pretty severe and abrupt changes to our climate in the coming future. And we should try as much as possible, and scientists are telling us we need to reduce emissions as quickly as possible to avoid a situation where we breach these climate tipping points, which have these feedbacks that just worsen the situation, leading to more rapid warming and accelerating warming. So it's something that we need to be very mindful of, and this is why scientists are saying we're in an emergency, and it's why the UN Secretary General is also saying we need to go into emergency mode action. And unfortunately, we are continuing to produce more and more emissions, and we're continuously setting records. But in 2020, it did drop under COVID by about 7%, if I'm not mistaken. But over the last decade, it's grew by about 1.5 percentage per year. And I just turned 35, but over my lifetime, we produce more emissions than we did for the entire period before my lifetime. So we're emitting greenhouse pollution at an accelerating rate, and this has got to stop. And there's no time to lose. We know what needs to be done. The science is very clear, is that if we want to avoid a certain temperature rise, we have to stop emitting emissions before we dump enough of this greenhouse pollution into the atmosphere to raise it at that point. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has said that we have about 218 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions left to burn before we go over 1.5. So to have an 83% chance of limiting warming to 1.5, we'd have to not emit more than that amount. And to put that into perspective, we emitted about 40 billion tons in 2021. So it's about 5 years of current emissions. So emissions have to drop quite significantly. And this would necessitate about upwards of about 10% a year, every year, this decade and the following decades till we reach zero emissions. And every year we postpone action, it requires steeper cuts to make up for lost time. Since it is a cumulative problem and we can't just remove CO2, it just means we have to emit even less the following year. So it's really a state of emergency, and what's going to require is very large and rapid changes for us to really avoid these tipping points and avoid going over 2 degrees of warming, and hopefully we can limit it to 1.5 degrees of warming. And had our politicians and had our leaders had acted on this sooner, we wouldn't have to reduce emissions this radically and in this short period of time. This just kind of illustrates it, how we started in 2016. You can see with the blue line that emissions would have actually dropped, would have to drop at a much slower rate. But since we waited, it just requires steeper cuts to limit to a certain temperature rise. So it's the emergency situation, to put it lightly. And there's an urgency. Part of the problem is our food system, which is extremely inefficient in turning inputs into outputs, and turning land and using land and using energy. And we know that agriculture is one of the main drivers, not just of climate change, but also pushing our Earth system over other planetary boundaries. So biodiversity loss, land use change, deforestation, chemical pollutants. So agriculture is playing a huge role in breaching these planetary boundaries. According to the United Nations, the food system accounts for about 21 to 37% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and takes up about half of the planet's habitable surface, as I mentioned before. And about 1/3 of the food we produce in the world for human consumption gets lost or wasted. So these are big problems. Food waste is definitely a big problem. And a growing challenge is that we have to do all of this, keeping in mind, with transform our food system, keeping in mind that there's going to be growing demand as the world population grows to about 10 billion by the year 2050. And animal culture, the rest of the presentation, I'm going to not so much focus on food system as a whole, but on an area that is underrepresented, which is animal farming. There's so much to talk about with the food system, but I thought this would be of interest to the work of EarthSafe. And there's a few reasons why we should be very concerned about animal farming. It's 50% of food system emissions correspond to the production of animal-based foods, including producing the feed of livestock. And livestock is responsible for about 14.5% of emissions, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which is the equivalent to about all of the tailpipe emissions of all the vehicles in the planet. There's a low energy conversion for animal products. So animal agriculture takes up 77% of agricultural land. It provides 17% of calories and 37% of the protein of global consumption. But then it's also one of the principal drivers of what animal farming is one of the principal drivers of water scarcity, biodiversity loss, deforestation, and land degradation. And well, just to illustrate it here, but you can see that compared to its plant-based alternatives or plant-based protein sources, the production of beef and eggs are not very efficient in using land and in using carbon to produce an equivalent amount of protein. So beef is the most polluting source of the most polluting protein source. It produces, it studies that showed about quite a lot more than legumes or even meat alternatives like Beyond Meat burgers, etc. There is an emergency to addressing methane emissions. So methane emissions are a little different than CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions will stay in the atmosphere for hundreds, not thousands of years, but methane emissions actually stay in the atmosphere for about a decade. So if you can reduce methane emissions, then you can actually slow the rate of warming. And considering that we're facing an emergency, we're trying to avoid these climate tipping points, there's even a more urgent need to move on methane faster than we have in the past. And that we can actually slow the rate of warming and hopefully not breach these tipping points by addressing emissions. And at the COP26 conference, the international conference that took place in Glasgow earlier this year, late last year, governments pledged to cut methane, but animal agriculture, even though it represents about 40% of global anthropogenic methane emissions, was not really discussed in the methane pledge, and it's focused mostly on methane coming from fossil fuel production. And just a point on cattle, because methane emissions primarily come from, when it comes to animal farming, primarily come from cattle. There's 1.5 billion cows internationally. Just so when people say, we have an overpopulation problem, well, we actually maybe have an overpopulation problem with cows, which require a lot more food than humans and are very inefficient at turning those into calories for human consumption. But in Canada, we have about 12.2 million, which is about two times the per capita average globally. And about 9.3% are located in Western provinces in the Prairie Grasslands. So 76% is located there. And animal farming in Canada represents about 4.4% of emissions, mostly from non-dairy cattle and dairy cattle. So it's definitely the largest polluter when it comes to animal farming in Canada. And it's an area of climate mitigation that's very much not addressed by the current policy framework that we have in this country. So how do we go about reducing animal farming emissions? Well, so in Canada, as I mentioned, it represents about animal farming represents about 4.4% of emissions. However, that might be actually underrepresented. So there was a study, I believe it was in environmental research letters, that looked at the methodology used to calculate the emissions from animal farming and found that it's likely underreported by about 40 to 90%. So it might actually be a larger share of Canada's emissions. And that represents the animal farming emissions represent about 54% of agricultural emissions in Canada. And animal farmers already have difficulties struggling and managing, adapting and managing adapting to climate change and cutting emissions in their sector. And as you can see, from 1990 to 2018, emissions from agriculture have kind of remained stable. So, however, they remain quite high in an area where there needs to be intervention. So, in the policy debate in Canada, much of what is being proposed is on the technical, and almost exclusively, actually, what's being proposed by the government and by the industry is technical and the management potential. So that's talking about ways of adding feed, like changing feed to reduce the methane being produced by cows, Probably people have heard about feeding seaweed and all of these other additives that can be added to reduce methane. But then also in animal developments in animal genetics, and then also changes in grazing management. We've heard about holistic management, or ways that maybe the cattle can help sequester carbon in the soil, and then better manure management, which are all of these technical changes in the transition are going to be important and will need to be implemented most likely. However, there is a need for dietary shifts, and these by themselves will not get us where we need to go. And according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, even if all animal farmers adopted the best practices of farmers with the lowest emissions, it would only lead to a reduction of about 33% of animal farming emissions. So there would still be a long way to go, even if we adopted the best measures. But this is a globally, and in Canada, we already have some of the best measures in terms of feed additives and in terms of these technical and management practices. So we've already made a lot of the gains that can already be made. However, that discussion is still being driven around, it's still focused primarily on technical and management changes. And dietary shifts towards plant-based diets, even though they offer a much larger potential, and in the international literature, like in the international institutions, like the IPCC, like the World Health Organization, United Nations Environmental Protection Agency, and these commissions that are being created internationally to look at this issue are coming to the conclusion that dietary shifts are needed. We're not discussing that in Canada. And another area that's interesting, that's worth kind of keeping an eye on, is this concept of carbon opportunity costs. And that if we want to save time, because the cuts and emissions that are required are so steep, if we would want to save time, we might want to consider trying to capture carbon. And one of the best ways to do so is to actually rewild and restore native ecosystems. And there's been studies on this, but if we were to reduce meat and dairy consumption, the land that's freed up by by doing so, but also freed up not only from where the animals are, but from the cropland that is used for feeding these animals. If we could use those spaces to rewild and restore ecosystems, we might be able to actually capture carbon and help save time and help, to give us more time to be able to reduce emissions. So in terms of climate mitigation and global strategy, it's actually really important that we consider the total potential to cut emissions and sequester carbon when it comes to dietary shifts. And again, as I mentioned, earlier, is that global land use is very inefficient at the moment, and we have to really re-examine how we use land in the future. What's recommended in the literature to reduce emissions, this is something that's not really discussed again in Canada, but according to the IPCC, it's the successful development. This is in their land use report that was released a couple of years ago, but the successful development of food systems under climate change conditions requires national level management that involves the cooperation of a number of institutions and government entities to enable more sustainable and beneficial production and consumption practices. So I have a graph of what the food system comprises, but it's not just environment, but it would also include other social indicators of well-being, including human health. But the food system is quite wide, and interventions are needed all across it. And I'm going to go over some of the ones that would be that this sort of coordinated national approach would need to address on the supply side as well as on the demand side. And the other thing that this kind of the emergency necessitates is an emergency and wartime framework. And one of my colleagues, Seth Klein, at the Climate Emergency Unit, has written a book about learning from the lessons that were of World War II, and the approach that the government took to addressing the war in terms of the home front mobilization that was done here to restructure our economy to help win the war. But there were a few lessons that kind of he points to, but that could be useful for how to think about how to approach this massive transformation of our food system that needs to be done in a very short period of time. And that's spend what it takes to win, create new institutions to get the job done, to move from voluntary and incentive-based measures to mandatory measures, to tell the truth about the climate and ecological emergency, and a just transition for workers and those affected. And in Canada, when it comes to mandatory measures, one of the areas in animal agriculture where there already is sort of mandatory measures for supply, and this is in the dairy and in poultry area, is supply management. So in Canada, we have a supply management system that sets quotas for how much dairy can be produced, poultry products, turkey. But this is just a big idea, but why not modernize supply management for the realities of the 21st century? And updating the mandate of the Farm Products Council of Canada, and extending supply management, not just to cover, extend it to cover other food products, such as non-dairy cattle, which is currently not covered, pigs, but also plant-based sources of protein, so that we can better manage the supply side as demand starts to change, and set in production quotas in line with our ecological objectives and human health objectives. And also just providing more transparency, which I'll get to in a moment. But Helen Horwath, a researcher at Harvard University, who's now at the Chatham House, has developed kind of a 3-step framework for what kind of ecological production controls could look like. But one is we need to peak livestock, and at the current numbers that we have at the moment, and then have a worst first approach. So once we've decided that we're going to limit the number of livestock and not grow the population above a certain number, then we'd have a worst first approach. Which one is the highest polluting and the most harmful for human health? And start by addressing that. And in this case, as I showed before, the biggest culprit is non-dairy cows. And then look at best available food. So look at what alternatives exist that can replace the best plant-based alternatives that can replace that source of calories and protein, and to ensure that there's an adequate supply to meet so that the shift can take place, and that we set these production quotas in line with what the science is saying is necessary in terms of reducing emissions and also addressing outer planetary boundaries. And so supply management is quite complex in Canada, but interestingly, they have provincial marketing boards that help with the promotion of dairy and other animal farming products. But these actually currently act as a barrier to dietary shifts towards plant-based foods. They have as a mandate to expand market access. So that is their mandate, is to try to find new markets and to expand the markets for milk and dairy producers and meat producers in Canada. And they also undertake market research to determine demand in order to inform quota setting. And they develop marketing campaigns. And I'm sure everybody has seen these dairy farmers of Ontario, chicken farmers of Canada, or in Quebec, c'est bon et deux c'est mieux, the milk ads. But yeah, these marketing boards are the products of Canadian law, even though there is quite a bit of independence, but these can be modernized to actually help with the shift towards plant-based diets. As products become more expensive, dairy products the price is increasing. We need a shift. One of the easy things that could be done is to shift towards plant-based alternatives, but we have to ensure that there's an adequate supply. And we also have to reduce the amount of milk being produced. So changing the mandate could be one of the things that we do. And here it's a little bit small, but this is kind of what it would look like over time if we were to peak in 2021 numbers and reduce the number of animals being farmed year by year by an amount that was in line with about the 10% decrease that's called for by science every year, which would by the end of this decade reduce emissions quite dramatically in the animal agriculture sector. However, there's one thing that needs to be kept in mind, and that's without import controls and without diplomacy, this is likely not going to be enough to reduce emissions from animal agriculture. Domestic demand is important. However, we are a large exporter. The majority, or almost the majority, of our of cow, and of cattle and cattle products are exported. The vast majority of pork products. So, and the trend is upwards. So we're exporting more and more. So even if there was I wish I had the name of the study, but there was one study done looking at, if the trend continues over the next 10 years of exports, but Canadians decided to reduce their meat and dairy consumption by about 33%, would it actually reduce emissions? And the answer is no. You would need to there would need to be so if there's no controls on exports, Canadian exports of meat and dairy, the emissions are going to continue to go up. So there needs to be negotiated between our different trading partners, controls and quotas on the amount that can be exported of animal and dairy products. And this is going to require quite clever diplomacy on the part of Canada to be a leader in this. The food system transformation, dietary shifts need to be happening in other parts of the world as well. Canada can take a leadership role and inspire other parts of the world to do so, and has, I would say, a moral obligation to do so. And then finally, the other thing on the supply side is the government needs to take into account the carbon opportunity cost in the way that they in their calculations. So at the moment, when the government considers what would happen to land if you were to remove cows, the only thing that they consider is what would be economically viable, and the only thing they think would be economically viable is to convert it to monocrops, which would affect the soil carbon. So going from let's say prairie grassland where has cattle on it to a monocrop would actually release quite a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. I believe it's about 33%, it's equivalent to 33% of what is emitted over a cow's life, just from removing that land, but just from converting the land to monoculture crops. But that's the only thing that they consider. They do not consider what would happen if you restored native ecosystem, or if you just kept the land as is. And that needs to be considered in their calculations. But from communications I've had with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, that is not part of their considerations and their studies. Kind of on the economic models show that that's just really not part of their thinking, and that needs to change. They need to be forward thinking and thinking in terms and more strategically about how to use land and how land can be used to store carbon. And again, just to restate, but any decision on land needs to have Indigenous peoples involved in the decision making about land use. They need to be at the decision table. And there are studies that show, that Indigenous peoples are the best custodians of land, and that under Indigenous stewardship, you have the best environmental outcomes. So there's an argument to be made, just pragmatically, but also there's a justice argument to be made that we need to redress past inequities and have them involved in all decisions about land, and the land that rightly belongs to them. And another discussion that needs to be taking place is reallocating subsidies. So there are groups like Nation Rising that have been discussing this, and there's more discussion about it, but subsidies in this country are disproportionately going towards dairy and meat production. And then this graph kind of shows you how much government support is going in the hundreds of thousands of dollars is going per 1,000 tons of a certain product. And you can see here that milk is just outsized in terms of how much government support it gets and how much we're financing milk publicly, taxpayers are, and also poultry products. And then you can see compared to peas, lentils, and plant-based sources of protein, there's very little support coming from the federal government. So we need to reallocate subsidies to plant-based foods. It provides support to animal farmers to transition to plant-based agriculture. And that's going to require large programs and institutions to be able to properly coordinate those type of education programs. And there also needs to be price mechanisms. It's also an issue of fairness, but there needs to be a guaranteed minimum price for farmers. We don't want people to be going bankrupt and lose their livelihoods out of this. So in parallel with education programs for learning how to transition to plant-based food production. People need to be able to make a living. And there also needs to be adjustments to subsidies to deal with inflation, but also other price controls to ensure that inflation is addressed in that a fair price, while we reduce the amount of animal products is found, so that people could survive. And it's absolutely essential, I would argue, for a matter of fairness and also for avoiding a backlash or revolt. If a sense of unfairness would really galvanize a backlash, and it's something that we want to avoid. In World War II, there's an interesting lesson. They learned that lesson the hard way, but they found out pretty quickly that without fairness in the policies that they were developing, it would be extremely difficult to mobilize as much as the public that was needed, as much as possible the public. So policies need to be fair, and it needs to be communicated well. There needs to be quite a lot of coordination to ensure that the price increases year by year don't negatively impact restaurateurs and other people across the food supply chain. So better coordination is definitely needed. And as part of this whole strategy. And also, there's quite a lot of research and development, and this is actually kind of really good news. But there's been a surge in capital investment globally over the last 2 years. And this graph on the right side from the Good Food Institute shows that just in the last 2019, there was a surge of about 3 times more than, in 2020, there was a surge of about 3 times more than what was in 2019, and 4.5 times more than what it was in 2018. So there's been a huge surge in the amount of investment in plant-based foods. And I think it's because just the climate emergency is becoming more and more present in people's minds, and people are seeing that the shift, dietary shifts are going to be part of our food future, and the better invest now in these alternatives, because they will be a big part of our diet in the future. And I think that there's been a drive to get more investments in this, and this is a good thing. And in Canada, the federal government, but as well as the Protein Industries Canada supercluster around proteins, have invested in innovation in plant-based proteins quite a bit in the last couple of years. So that is good news, but more investment is needed, and a regulatory framework for rapid expansion of plant-based foods. And Protein Industries Canada has developed recommendations on what that could possibly look like. But even if you have an increase in the supply side, you'd still have the issue that you would need demand side policies to match them, and to accelerate the change. So we could depend on just there being more supply in the grocery stores, and that people are gonna, slowly start choosing more plant-based foods. But there is an argument to be made that we need to mobilize as many people as possible to change their diets in a very small period of time, and that the market information place or the information marketplace has failed to really inform the public about the need for these dietary shifts. And I would argue that there is a need for large-scale information campaigns to inform people about the need for these dietary shifts. And these do not exist at the moment. The federal government has been very reluctant to make any statements about the need for dietary shifts, and has kind of, with their dietary guide that was released a few years ago, had a couple of lines about the environmental footprint of food, without saying specifically which foods have the highest environmental footprint, even though the literature is pretty well established on it. But we need a suite of demand-side policies to get people to start shifting their diets and to start making more informed purchases and participate in this social mobilization to transform our food system. And that requires policies that will inform and empower people, guide and influence them. And I'll go over what these could look like in a moment. But then also there's some interventions, some better than others, but to reduce consumption of unsustainable foods. And this is something that at the Climate Emergency Unit we think would be very beneficial at this point in time, but something like a climate ecological emergency information board based off the Wartime Information Board during World War II. So at the time during World War II, there was this issue that the public wasn't embarking in social and economic mobilization, at least not sufficiently. And that there was a problem with information getting to people and people understanding the full depth of the problem, but also why certain policies were needed. For example, rationing rationing of fuel or rationing of food, and then changes in diets were also a big part of what was done in Canada. And Ian Mosby in a book actually documents quite a lot of the changes that were done during World War II to the food system in this country. But a climate and ecological information board could be used to mandate to ensure that Canadians are fully informed about the environmental and social impacts of the food system, the urgency to act, and what they need to do for the success of the food system's transformation. So this agency would just have the tools at its disposal, would inform as many people as possible to reach, I would say, everybody from coast to coast to coast, to make the case for, among other things, the need for dietary shifts and food system transformation and what that would look like. We have nothing of that scale at the moment. We have piecemeal information coming out in some news reports. There's very little Canadian-specific information on the internet, and this needs to happen urgently. And an information board with the resources to be able to reach as many Canadians as possible and make the case would be hugely beneficial to drive the type of change that's needed. And people need the full information about the supply and demand side to win over support for policies. There needs to be transparency about why these decisions are being made. None of it will work. And if we want to avoid a backlash, we know that full transparency about the science, about the assumptions being made is essential. And we've learned this during COVID, but we need to be transparent about the data and about the modeling to prevent people from mistrusting the information. And prevent backlash. So then we have to have that, we have to have that win it attitude when it comes to the food system transformation that has to happen very rapidly. But I would argue that even under COVID, we haven't had the type of information campaigns that we saw during World War II that lasted years and that were sustained in over a long period of time. There was information campaigns. I'm not going to go over them. But other measures that could be put in place: mandatory eco-labeling, marketing bans, and new rules on advertising. There has been discussion in Quebec. We've had bans on advertising to youth under the age of 12 since, I believe, the 80s. It's the only jurisdiction in North America. But ad bans are not something they're not foreign to us. And then they're also being implemented in places like Amsterdam, where there are bans on some high polluting advertising bans on some high polluting activities in the city. but we need to address, the promotion of high polluting activities, including the consumption of high polluting foods. And just to mention it, CBC was a world leader, being the first to ban tobacco ads, broadcaster to ban tobacco ads back in the day. And another area for intervention is public food procurement, but the National School Lunch Program that was announced by the federal government, what it was about $1 billion over the next 5 years. But if we do have a national school lunch program, why not make it a plant-based school lunch program? And there's discussion about that in California. It's going in the Senate to have plant-based food made accessible to cafeterias in the states, the state schools. And at this point, I would argue that meatless Mondays are just not. Maybe over a decade ago, that was. That could have been part of an incremental approach, but there's now really not much time, and these incremental approaches will, just not cut it at this point. But these should be coupled with programs to try to build the food skills and the food literacy among young people so that they can really address over the long term the bigger, the food system transformation that's required, but also to make sound dietary choices in line with their health, but also planetary health. Food procurement. So government institutions and canteens can also take leadership and start procuring plant-based food. Just a point really quickly, I'm realizing that probably going a little over time, but on meat and dairy level, there has been discussion about limiting consumption of meat by taxing meat and dairy. Personally, I think that would actually be seen as very unfair and probably lead to a backlash. And there has been quite a dramatic increase in the price of milk and butter in the last year, as well as meat. That has led to a reduction in consumption. But if you're going to add on top of that more dissuasive taxes, I really can see there being a backlash to this. And other measures should be explored, like, as I mentioned, information campaigns and as well as measures on the supply side to reduce animal production, animal farming at the source. And before we get to the discussion, I just want to go over the point on needing to get organized. As I mentioned, this is an issue it's at a nascent phase in Canada. We don't really there's quite a lot of environmental groups, but the dietary shifts and food system transformation of the type that outlined in this presentation, but also that's been discussed in international forums, is not very much just a part of the discussion within the mainstream environmental movement in this country, although there starting to be attempts to do so, but this needs to rapidly change, and we need to be demanding that environmental groups step up on this. But it also, it also requires leadership from meta types of organizations, and I'm happy that there are groups like EarthSave that have been taking leadership on this issue, despite the fact that it's just, the environmental movement has just not been acting on it as it should be, frankly. But in Canada, the Canadian climate, food, and climate policy landscape has been, as I mentioned, mostly focused on technical and management changes, but there's almost no focus in the policy research community on supply side policies of limiting and shifting production, on demand side to shift diets, and on governance change. It's been very much focused on voluntary measures, provided market-based mechanisms, and focused on incremental change. And part of the reason is that the meat industry is driving this discussion. We've been outspent and out-organized. They're actively lobbying, even at the moment. The Canadian Cattlemen's Association, GBS, other large meat processing companies have been actively lobbying to get federal government and the provincial governments for decades. There's a great New York Times piece about this with a video that just came out a couple of weeks ago, or about a week ago, that kind of goes over what this looks like in the United States. They have enormous budgets, and they're actively promoting themselves in the media as sustainability leaders and have the resources to be present in the media landscape to make their case. But there needs to be a citizens campaign We need to develop these policy proposals. There needs to be a research agenda developed by the academic community that's interested in this. And these need to be at the base of the advocacy work of a citizens movement and of the climate movement, but to bring this issue to the fore. We need to put the issue on the government's agenda. And what this issue, I mean reducing meat and dairy production and consumption, which is really at the base of the problem. And in the short term, we do have a consultation on the agricultural policy framework that is currently underway, and we need to work at all three levels of government. But we need to win over the public support, and that requires media. We need to be more vocal, and we need to be more present in people's living rooms, in their homes, so that they know more about this issue, because it is just not really being that, even it's not being that discussed. I guess a positive thing is that people are starting to be informed about it, even though there's very limited information. So just imagine what would happen if this was discussed even more and more in the media. And I'll just end by mentioning the lessons from the trucker convoy is that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. You can disagree with what they're calling for, as I do. But we know from social movement history and from lessons from social movements is that that being disruptive and being loud gets you heard. It gets you in people's living rooms and gets your issue at the forefront of the political agenda. And we now have politicians having to respond. And that was the case with Animal Rebellion in the UK when they blockaded the McDonald's processing plants. It was also the case of Extinction Rebellion. It really brought the issue of the climate emergency to the fore in 2019 in Quebec, but it wasn't really liked by the political class. And it was also the case in the 2012 student movement, where people didn't necessarily agree with the tactics of the students, but it forced the issue to the forefront of the political agenda. And people were talking about it day after day after day, and people had an opinion about student tuition hikes. And for food system transformation, considering the scale of the challenge and the forces that, the scale of the challenge, that's transformation needed, and the fact that it's just not really discussed, it's hard to see how we would get as much the type of media attention needed without learning from past successful social movements. They're often disruptive. They often use nonviolent direct action to bring the issue to public's attention, but they do work to shift public opinion and the Overton window towards what was originally thought as impossible to something that might actually be possible and doable. Thank you for listening, and and I'm happy to take any questions and have a discussion. Willing to stay a little longer if people want to stay.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That was very, very informative. We do have a couple minutes left here, so let's see if we can deal with a question or two. And the first question relates to the impact on the economy, that would come from such a dramatic carbon reduction target. And in particular, certain sectors and obviously farmers might be very, very impacted by that type of shift. So are you familiar with any models or strategies for how to deal with, for example, compensating farmers or any other kind of way to incentivize that kind of massive change in land use?
Yeah, so I guess a current past example is what we've doing with the just transition with coal workers. So providing training programs to transition people over to clean energy. But I guess maybe for land use, one of the more salient examples would be the shift to the ban on tobacco and the measures to reduce tobacco consumption. There were whole communities that were impacted by this across Canada that were tobacco growing communities, whose culture was affected by this, whose economies were affected by this. And the federal government put in place quite a few measures. One is to buy back land, but also provide opportunities for people to transition to the land that was used for growing tobacco to other crops. And that's maybe a model that we can learn from. In terms of other economic measures in World War II, I would just say that the emergency approach that we're putting forward, and that what's interesting is that World War II, the question about how much it would cost never really kind of like it came up, but it wasn't really that important because they had to spend what it took to win. Or else the alternative was the possibility of global fascism and and the destruction of like Canadian democracy basically. But in this case, the alternative to not actually taking these actions is that our agricultural system will be more and more impacted by climate change, and it will be more costly in the long run. But during World War II, the actually difference to what they did now then and what's existing now is that they created the economic institutions to coordinate the economic transformation that was needed, to set price ceilings, to set the production ceilings, and have quotas, etc. But there was a whole bunch of institutions that I don't have all the answers, but what we know is that there were institutions that were created to be able to deal with the economic turmoil from the type of mobilization that they were undertaking at the time. And perhaps these type of economic institutions and departments need to be created to kind of really think through what type of impact this is going to have and what type of measures would be needed to mitigate as much as possible the impact that this type of rapid transformation would necessitate or would entail.
Okay, thank you. Let me see if we can address one more question before we go. So given how quickly we need to act in this situation, as you say, it's an emergency. We need the government to take action. It doesn't appear that the current government's plan is on track. And how can we, how can we convince them of what needs to be done quickly enough to make this happen?
Yeah, that's a question I've been thinking quite a bit about. It's like we have this liberal government that was just elected in a minority situation, and we need that government to be the ones that will initiate some of these large scale reforms that needed, that should have been started years ago. But it needs to happen now. And if we're going to wait a few more years, it's just we've locked in additional warming, and it's the situation is even worse. And the need for even more urgent action is required. So how do we get this liberal government to be acting when they're not even acknowledging that a food system transformation is required, that we need to shift diets? And I think that's where we need to be very creative in terms of, if we're citizens, the type of citizens actions that we could take. I mentioned some areas, but I think one of the areas, some areas, creating the kind of the policy agenda or the policy platform that would of a food system transformation. But then we also need to be more people to be very loud on this. And that's where potentially the work of building strong and nimble coalitions of influential organizations can potentially get us into the media landscape, to bring this issue to the fore, so that they hear about it, so that it's just not one of the that it goes up the political agendas from maybe at the very low priority to one of the top priorities. And I would argue it needs to be one of the top priorities, definitely, as well as phasing out fossil fuels, but food system needs to be happening in parallel. But there's also a limit to that as well. If you only have the media's attention just once in a blue moon, once a month, let's say, you're not really getting the people, enough people for it to actually have a political influence. And this is why I think lessons from social movements. I was involved in the 2012 student strike, as I mentioned, but that really brought a pretty niche issue of tuition hike increases that typically people just do not care about, to the forefront of the national discussion in this province for months. But it required quite a lot of people mobilizing and being very loud about it. And it required a student strike. And, there are student climate strikers out there, and they can potentially be worked with, and this issue can be brought to the groups. I know that Fridays for Future globally has been discussion in animal agriculture and has been active on the EU agriculture policy. But in Canada, we also have a student movement, and that's potentially an ally of a group that can be worked with to help, bring that kind of attention needed to the issue. But outside, we can't just rely on youth. We also have to get out of our comfort zone. And I think that, again, I'm not endorsing the trucker convoy, but just what has worked to try to get government's attention in the last, on an issue recently to drive the political discussion. It has been very loud and disruptive action on behalf of by this trucker convoy, and we shouldn't be surprised by that, because social movements, the student movement in the Philippines, Extinction Rebellion in the UK, have all used these type of disruptive tactics in the past to bring an issue that the government does not want to discuss or just doesn't think is a priority to the fore, and to force the discussion. And if we want this to be happening very quickly, I would say we need to be thinking about how we could, we don't have to replicate what the truckers did. That's not what I'd say, but we have to just learn from social movements about what works to try to get that type of attention on an issue. And I think that might be the only way in the short term to bring that type of attention to the urgency of the food system transformation.
Right, so lots of work to do there, and probably a variety of different approaches are needed. Earth Save Canada obviously works hard to bring this type of information to the public so that people can be aware of what's going on and what needs to be done. And I'll just mention as well, Anthony, because I know you're involved in it as well, that there is the newly formed Coalition for a Sustainable Food Transition, which is a coalition of organizations in Canada that's going to be working to try to get this topic on the agenda of our politicians. But we need everybody to get involved, quite frankly. So unfortunately,
if I could just add one thing, it's also, there is a climate movement that's quite active, and I think that it would be possible to include a call for food system transformation in the broader climate movement discourse. So when there are these other moments where the climate movement, like in 2019, was really, getting a lot of media attention, that the food system transformation is part of the discussion. And I think that just, the coalition that we're working on, but also other citizen initiatives to engage with the climate movement could potentially get that call for a food system transformation as part of the discussion.
That's a great point as well. Yeah, thank you. So that's all the time we have for questions right now. Hopefully we can continue the discussion in the comments. Thank you so much, Anthony, for sharing this information with us today. And I'll just mention that we do have a giveaway for those who have posted questions or comments, and winners will be notified through Facebook. Thank you very much, and we'll see you for the next speaker series.